She arrived every morning at exactly 8:15, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. She always sat on the same weathered wooden bench, partially shaded by an old oak tree, from where she could watch the bed of lavender and daisies the city kept in Lents Park in Portland. If you find meaning in stories about unlikely love, silent secrets, and lives that bloom when no one expects it, subscribe to this channel. Every story is a window into what we feel but rarely say out loud. Eleanor didn't draw attention. Short grey hair, always neatly ironed linen blouse, eyes that seemed tired of waiting, yet still knew how to appreciate the beauty of a well-formed petal. She brought with her a hardcover book, usually American poetry or an old war memoir. She read very little. Most of the time, she just looked around as if waiting for something, anything, to happen. Her husband Howard had died 6 years earlier, a sudden heart attack between breakfast and his morning walk. Her sons, 2 men who had grown up too fast, were scattered between California and Minnesota, busy with their own families, replying to her messages with emojis and, "I'll call you later, Mom." She didn't blame anyone, it just hurt. The house had become too big, the television too loud, the night too long. So she came to the garden, to breathe in the scent of plants, to hear the creak of leaves in the wind, and to remind herself that the world was still there, breathing. There wasn't much to hope for. At 67, Eleanor knew the great moments of life were behind her. Love, surprise, desire, those things belonged to the young. What remained was silence. And silence, when tended to, could also bloom. She didn't speak to anyone. She recognized faces. The man who jogged with earbuds, the woman in the pink coat with her asthmatic dog, the elderly couple who always argued quietly, but no names. And that was fine. Solitude, when chosen, is a kind of freedom. That Wednesday morning, something was different. There was someone new in the garden. A young man wearing a worn-out cap and soil-stained pants crouched near the rose bushes. He wore green gloves, his arms exposed to the sun, and moved his hands with a gentleness she recognized immediately. It was the gesture of someone who respects what they touch. She didn't know his name. But she knew, with that silent certainty that sometimes overtakes those who watch in stillness, that her routine was about to change. And for the first time in many months, Eleanor didn't open her book. His name wasn't something she heard right away. It came weeks later, after many silent mornings and the slow construction of something she didn't yet dare call connection. Until then, she simply thought of him as the boy with the earth on his hands. He arrived early, usually before her. By the time she reached the bench, he was already tending to the soil, his knees in the dirt, pruning, watering, shifting small plants as if he were helping them find their voice. He never rushed. There was something poetic about how he worked, not out of obligation, but as if the plants trusted him to understand their needs. Eleanor began noticing the details. The way he tucked his gloves into the back of his jeans when he stopped to drink water. How he always paused just for a second before trimming a rose, as if asking permission. The small notebook he kept in his back pocket, which he sometimes opened to sketch. Not flowers, she noticed, but people. Faces, postures. One morning she brought him an apple. She didn't plan it. She simply had 2 in her bag, and it felt wrong not to offer one. He looked surprised, then smiled. Not wide, but warm. "Thanks," he said, his voice deeper than she expected. "I'm Noah." She nodded. Eleanor. They didn't say anything else that day, but the next morning she brought banana bread. He accepted it like a child being handed a treasure. In return, he brought her a single flower, a dahlia, carefully wrapped in newspaper. No note. Just the flower. That was how it started. Not with declarations, not with intention, with gestures, with small kindnesses that said, "I see you in a world where most people stop looking." Noah was 23, she would learn. He had dropped out of college, worked odd jobs. "Gardening," he said one day, "wasn't something I planned, but it feels like something I'm supposed to be doing." Eleanor didn't ask much more. She could feel there were wounds behind that soft voice, behind the strong arms and careful hands. And perhaps without realizing it, she was already beginning to want to understand them. Their rhythm was wordless. She would read. He would work. Sometimes their eyes met. Sometimes he sat near the bench, just to sip water. One day, she found him humming softly. It was Leonard Cohen. That evening, back at home, Eleanor didn't turn on the TV. She sat by the window, holding the dahlia he'd given her, and wondered how someone so young could already carry so much silence in him, and how that silence felt oddly familiar. The first time they ate together, it wasn't planned. Eleanor had packed a turkey sandwich and an extra thermos of mint tea. It was a Wednesday, warmer than usual for spring, and Noah had been working all morning, sweat tracing lines on his neck. She hesitated before offering. It felt strange, maternal perhaps, but he smiled when she held out the sandwich. "You're spoiling me," he said, sitting carefully on the far end of the bench. "Don't get used to it," she replied, though her voice betrayed a flicker of warmth she hadn't felt in years. They ate slowly, in silence. The air smelled of rosemary and damp soil. Noah stretched his legs, glancing occasionally at a small robin hopping near the flower bed. Eleanor poured tea into 2 paper cups. When she handed him one, their fingers brushed, just slightly, but it was enough to send a quiet tremor through her. He noticed. Not the tremor, perhaps, but the silence that followed it. And instead of speaking, he drank the tea, nodded softly, and leaned back against the bench like he belonged there. From that day on, Wednesdays became theirs. She tried new recipes: chicken salad, zucchini bread, lentil soup in a thermos. He started bringing small things in return. A poem scribbled on scrap paper, a jar of honey from a local market, a book of pressed flowers. They never named it. There was no definition, no agreement. But something had shifted. Eleanor found herself waking up earlier, checking the weather with unexpected purpose. She stood longer before the mirror, not to correct wrinkles, but to decide whether blue or cream suited her better that morning. Noah, in turn, began finishing his rounds near the rosebeds more slowly, giving himself space to sit beside her just a little longer. He asked questions about her books, her favourite foods, her childhood in Oregon. He listened like her stories mattered. And slowly, the garden became more than just a place. It became a pause, a breathing space between the noise of the world and the ache of what's missing. A quiet acknowledgement that loneliness, when shared even in silence, begins to loosen its grip. One afternoon, as they watched a butterfly land on a marigold, Noah said, "You have kind eyes." Eleanor didn't answer. She only smiled, half embarrassed, half grateful, and for the first time in years, undeniably alive. It was mid-May when Eleanor noticed something new near the bench, a cluster of vibrant dahlias, deep purple and coral, blooming in a spot that had previously been bare soil. She tilted her head, unsure. Those hadn't been there the day before. Noah appeared minutes later, wiping his hands on a rag. He caught her gaze and smiled. "They weren't on the maintenance list," he said casually. "But I thought, maybe they should be." Eleanor walked closer, knees careful, breath held. The dahlias were freshly planted, the soil still damp, the stems upright like sentinels. She knelt slowly, one hand grazing the petals. "They were Howard's favourite," she whispered, almost to herself. "I didn't know," Noah said, voice soft. She looked up at him, the air between them heavy and light all at once. It wasn't just a gesture, it was memory made visible. A grief she carried alone now shared, even if unknowingly, by someone who had only just stepped into her life. From that morning on, the dahlias became their silent witnesses. Noah didn't explain why he'd planted them, and Eleanor didn't ask. But every day she brought a small cloth to dust the bench, and sometimes a folded napkin with shortbread cookies. He kept showing up, earlier than he needed to, and lingered even after his tasks were done. One morning, a woman with a stroller passed by and gave them both a long glance, the kind that carries questions people rarely voice. Eleanor felt her spine tighten. Noah noticed. "Let them look," he said, his tone not rebellious, just sure. "They don't know what this is." Eleanor turned away, pretending to adjust her sweater. "I'm not even sure I do." "You don't have to," he said, sitting beside her, elbows resting on his knees. "Some things don't need names." She nodded, though a part of her still flinched. It wasn't propriety that troubled her. It was possibility. She had lived decades with rules, roles, and routines, and now here was this boy. Man, really, planting flowers that touched parts of her heart she thought had dried up with time. She caught herself watching the way his hands moved when he tied back his hair, the curve of his cheek in sunlight. She felt both foolish and young, a feeling she didn't know she missed until it returned. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found a folded paper beneath one of the dahlias. Noah's handwriting, rough and unpracticed, yet unmistakably his. It read, "Some flowers grow best out of season, some hearts bloom late and still matter." She held the note close, unsure whether to smile or cry. Instead, she simply stayed. It started with a whisper. A neighbour Eleanor had known for 20 years leaned across the hedge and asked, "Who's that young man you've been meeting in the park?" The question wasn't cruel, but it was sharp. It slipped beneath Eleanor's skin like a splinter. She shrugged. "Just someone who works there." The woman tilted her head, her eyes curious in that familiar performative way. "He's very attentive." That night, Eleanor skipped her walk. She stayed indoors, washed dishes that didn't need washing, and left the dahlia note untouched on the windowsill. The next morning, she hesitated. She stood in the hallway, jacket in hand, unsure whether to go. The idea of sitting on that bench, being seen, now felt exposed, vulnerable, like a secret too close to sunlight. She didn't go. For 3 days, the bench remained empty. On the 4th day, her phone buzzed, an unknown number. It was a text, "Hope everything's okay. Missed our tea. N." She stared at it for a long time, the silence of her living room louder than ever. That afternoon, she returned to the park. Noah was pruning by the dahlias. When he saw her, he didn't speak. He just offered the same quiet smile, the one that said, "I see you," and kept working. They sat in silence for a while. She sipped her tea without offering him any. Finally, she said, "People talk." Noah nodded. "They always do. I'm old enough to be your mother." He glanced at her steady. "But you're not." She looked away. "It's not about us. It's about how it looks." "Then don't look at it. Feel it." It sounded so simple, but it wasn't. She had lived a lifetime according to expectations, wife, mother, widow. Her love had been bound by decades of formality and duty. What she felt now wasn't just affection. It was dislocation. Like time had tilted, and she was suddenly someone she didn't recognize. And yet here he was, unaffected, unwavering, present. Noah leaned forward, his hands covered in soil, his voice gentle. "If it helps, you make me feel less lost." That undid something in her. A knot that had been tightening since her neighbour's question. "I don't know what this is," she said, barely audible. He reached over, just enough for their hands to touch. "Neither do I," he whispered. "But I don't want to stop finding out." The bench, once just a place to sit, now felt like the edge of something sacred. Not quite love, not yet, but something real enough to protect. The change wasn't sudden, but it was unmistakable. Eleanor began to feel it in small moments. The pause in her breath when Noah laughed, the quiet flutter beneath her ribs when he touched her shoulder to point out a rare blossom, the ache of anticipation she now carried between visits to the park. It frightened her, not because she didn't want it, but because she did. She was 67. Her skin no longer had the smoothness of youth. Her hands bore the map of years, and her reflection, though still elegant, now revealed time's insistence. What could someone like Noah possibly see in her that wasn't just gratitude, projection, confusion? One late afternoon, the garden nearly empty, Eleanor dared to ask. They sat side by side, the bench warm from the day's sun. She turned toward him slowly, her voice brittle. "Why are you doing this? Spending time with me?" Noah didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the flower beds, the wind lifting strands of his hair. "My mother left when I was 10, he said. "I don't remember her face clearly, just the smell of her hair when she hugged me. I think I've been looking for that kind of safety ever since." Eleanor stayed still. "I tried girlfriends. I tried not feeling anything. Didn't work. Most people want to be seen, but not deeply. With you, I don't have to pretend I'm whole." She felt her throat tighten. "I don't feel like I'm healing you," she said. "I feel like I'm breaking some rule." Noah turned to her, his gaze steady. "Maybe love isn't about fixing or breaking. Maybe it's just about being where you feel honest." She laughed, dryly. "Honesty doesn't erase age." "No," he said. "But it makes it irrelevant." There was a long pause between them, the kind that held more truth than any sentence. Then, without ceremony, Noah reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a small photo, him as a child, no older than 9, holding a daisy chain with a woman in shadow behind him. "I bring this with me," he said, "not to remember her, but to remind myself what I still need." Eleanor touched the edge of the photo, her fingers brushing his. Her voice was almost a breath. "And do I give you that?" He didn't answer. He leaned his forehead against hers, just briefly. a gesture more intimate than a kiss. In that moment, Eleanor wasn't thinking about age or appearances or whispers behind hedges. She was thinking about the way his presence softened the ache in her chest, how his silences aligned with hers, how she hadn't felt this alive, this aware of her own skin in decades, and how, maybe, just maybe, love wasn't about the rules we've inherited, but about the rules we're brave enough to rewrite. The announcement came on a small laminated poster taped to the park's notice board. Community garden showcase, open contest for gardeners and enthusiasts, pairs encouraged. Eleanor read it twice, her brow furrowed. Noah leaned beside her, sipping from his water bottle. "We should enter." She blinked. "We?" He smiled. "You've been feeding me and giving me poetry. That's half the work." She hesitated, scanning the other names already signed up. Mostly pairs of retirees, families, some young couples. "They'll talk," she murmured. "They already do," he replied. "Let them talk louder." That week, they prepared the garden not just for judging, but for something bigger. Exposure. They chose dahlias, of course, but also planted wild violets and marigolds, and rearranged the stone path near their bench. Eleanor brought handmade signs with quotes about love and resilience. Noah added a trellis made from repurposed wood, shaped like an open arch. They worked side by side, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply moving in rhythm. The day of the showcase was bright and warm. Visitors strolled through the paths, pointing at arrangements, asking about plant types. Some paused at their section, curious. A few frowned. One older man muttered something about unusual pairs, but others stayed longer, listened, asked questions, laughed with them. An elderly couple from Seattle praised the emotional layout. A teenager took a picture and said, "This feels like a place where something important happened. They didn't win first place." That went to a mother and daughter who'd built a miniature fairy garden complete with LED light. But Eleanor and Noah were given a special mention for harmony, intention, and heart. As they stood side by side accepting the ribbon, Eleanor's hand found Noah's. She didn't pull away, someone clapped. Others joined in. A soft ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Not agreement, not applause for romance, but respect. For presence, for courage. For two people refusing to apologize for how they chose to be seen. Later, as they sat on their bench, Eleanor held the ribbon on her lap. "I didn't expect it to feel like this," she said. "Like what?" "Like we earned something no one else even knew we were trying to grow." Noah looked at her, his voice quiet. "We did." And for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor didn't care who was watching. The chill came earlier that year. By late September, the leaves in Lentz Park had already begun their slow surrender, rusting into gold and copper. The garden, still vibrant in colour, now carried the scent of earth turning inward, preparing for rest. So was Eleanor. She moved more slowly. Some days she stayed home. When she did come, she sat with her hands wrapped around a hot thermos, less talkative, her gaze distant. Noah noticed the change but didn't push. Instead, he adjusted. Brought thicker cushions for the bench. Prepared warm broth in a jar. Walked at her pace. One morning as he knelt to tie her shoelace, she rested her hand on his head. "You'll be the one remembering this," she said softly. He looked up. "We both will." That night, Noah asked if he could visit her home. It was the first time the garden didn't hold their meeting. She hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Her home had been a shrine to stillness, a place untouched by new life. To let him in was to make him part of a space where Howard's coat still hung behind the door, where photos of her children remained in frames they never saw. But she said yes. Noah arrived with a small bouquet and quiet steps. He moved gently through the living room, pausing to look at old records, dusty books, the fireplace that hadn't been used in years. They sat on the couch without turning on the lights. Only the amber from a street lamp filtered through the curtains. "I don't have much," she whispered. He looked at her, his voice low. "You have this moment, and I want to be in it." She reached for his hand, the skin thin over her bones, the touch warm and trembling. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. That night he stayed. Not out of desire, but out of devotion. He held her through the coughing, read to her when her eyes blurred, played old folk songs on her radio. When she slept, he sat nearby and drew her hand in his notebook, lines, creases, softness. The garden became quieter in the following weeks, less laughter, more stillness, but the dahlias still bloomed. And Eleanor, even as her breath shortened and her voice grew faint, began each morning asking, "Is he coming today?" Always, yes, because by then, Noah no longer tended just to the flowers. He tended to her. The last morning was quiet. The sky hung low, painted in the pale blue of late autumn. A light mist clung to the edges of Lentz Park, softening everything it touched. The garden was nearly empty, just a few early walkers and the hush of falling leaves. Noah arrived at Eleanor's house just after dawn. She was in her chair by the window, wrapped in the thick quilt he had brought her weeks before. Her breath was shallow but even. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers curled slightly inward. He knelt beside her and whispered, "The dahlias are still blooming." She smiled, barely. "Tell me again," she said, her voice dry as parchment. He leaned in. "You sat on the bench at 8:15. I was already there, pretending not to notice. You brought me an apple. I didn't even like apples back then." She chuckled, just a puff of air, but it reached her eyes. Noah took her hand and pressed it to his cheek. The warmth there was fading. She looked at him, her gaze unfocused but filled with something deeper than vision. "I didn't expect this," she said. "I didn't either," he replied. "But I'm grateful every day that it found us." For a long while there were no more words. Just the ticking of a small clock and the soft sound of wind brushing against the glass. Then, as the light shifted across the room, her breathing changed. A slow, unravelling exhale, like the closing of a soft door. Her grip loosened, and her head tilted slightly toward his shoulder. Noah didn't move. He sat with her, holding her hand, until the sun rose a little higher and touched the windowsill with gold. When he finally stood, he kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'll take care of the garden." Later that day, he returned to Lentz Park. The bench was cold. The dahlias leaned into the wind. He sat down and placed a single note beside him, the one she had once folded into her coat. Some flowers grow best out of season. Some hearts bloom late and still matter. People passed by, some glanced at him, none interrupted. Because in that stillness something sacred had been completed. Noah wept quietly, not for loss, but for the beauty of having known her. And the garden, their garden, kept breathing. Winter passed without fanfare. The garden rested beneath frost and silence. The dahlias withered as they always did, and Noah pruned them with the same care he had shown when planting them. But the bench remained, and so did he. Every morning, rain or shine, Noah came to Lentz Park. He sat on the same bench where she had once waited with folded hands and unread poetry. Sometimes he read aloud, more often he just sat, eyes closed, remembering. He didn't need the words anymore. Her presence lingered not in books, but in the spaces they had shaped together. People began to notice. At first, just regular visitors, joggers, dog walkers, retirees. They'd nod at Noah, then at the bench, like acknowledging something unspoken. Over time, someone placed a small plaque on the backrest, carved in simple script. "For Eleanor, some hearts bloom late and still matter." Noah didn't know who did it. He never asked. By March, the garden was waking again. The dahlias pushed new shoots through the thawed soil. Violets returned, and the arch Noah had built, once just wood, now stood wrapped in ivy, delicate and alive. On the day of the spring equinox, a young couple came to take engagement photos beside the flowers. The woman asked Noah, "Do you work here?" He smiled. "No, I just keep something alive." She tilted her head, curious, but didn't press. They posed by the bench. She rested her head on her partner's shoulder. Noah watched, heart full and still. That night, he left a copy of Eleanor's favourite poem under the bench, sealed in plastic, weighed down by a smooth stone, a gift for whoever needed it next. He no longer felt lost. Grief had settled not as pain, but as presence. Love, he had learned, wasn't just about holding on. It was about tending, and returning, and remembering. In the years that followed, people kept coming. Some sat, some wept, some smiled without knowing why. The garden became known not for its size or variety, but for something harder to name. Warmth, meaning, legacy. And Noah remained its quiet guardian because some loves don't vanish, they take root, and when the season is right, they bloom again. And so it was that a grey-haired woman and a young man with earth-stained hands wrote, without promises or definitions, a story that didn't fit any mould, but bloomed anyway. The love between Eleanor and Noah didn't just defy social expectations, it unravelled silence, healed hollow spaces, and proved that time doesn't measure the worth of a feeling. Sometimes it just prepares the soil. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, every story is a reminder that even in the most unlikely corners of life, something beautiful can still grow.